this afternoon session talking about science communication in the era of COVID-19. Today, we've got a distinguished panel and a very exciting perspective coming from Brazil with Attila Lamarino, from Spain with Angel Rodriguez, from Sweden with Cici Aspro, and from Denmark with Jens Degget. So I will first of all introduce you Attila Lamarino, who is based in Sao Paulo. He has become a really landmark example of science communication at its best with his podcast and science video for the YouTube channel Nerdologia, which boasts more than 1 million subscribers. So he will share his own experience of doing science communication during the lockdown in Brazil. And no doubt you will learn quite a few things you didn't know. So Attila, it's all yours.
Hello, nice to meet you all. Thank you, Sabine, for the introduction. I'm sure you learned some things. Brazil has been following a quite unique path on COVID at this time, and we also have a unique preference for social media and science consumption that is quite a bit different from many countries. So I'm a science outreach communicator here in Brazil for some long time. At least since 2007, I do blogs, podcasts, videos, but my science education is on biology. I'm a biologist. I did a PhD in virology, studying HIV, Zika virus, Ebola. So this year we had this perfect mix of a terrible situation with viruses and a background of science communication and a science education that I have that is on viruses. So I could mix both and talk about science here and explain COVID in Brazil, as very few could do here, and few less were able to because of whatever happened here. So Brazil has a long mix of science and social media that not always is quite productive or brings us good results. We have a past history of social media dictating medicine and medicine approaches in Brazil. So for example, in 2015 and 2016, we have what I would say is the first medicine based in social media decision we had. So we had this chemistry professor that synthesized a compound. So I'm sorry if I mispronounce it in English, but it's phosphoethanolamine, and it's a chemical compound used in the past for many things, not necessarily for cancer treatments, that what he was promoting. And he started to give it to people, saying that it was a cancer cure. It wasn't a medicine. It wasn't tested for cancer. It wasn't didn't go through clinical trials or anything. And suddenly it started a social media movement of people talking about the drug and wanting to take it as a cancer cure. So Brazilians consume social media as very few countries do. We have 98 or 99% of the cell phones here, the smartphones here, using WhatsApp. We have one of the largest audiences on YouTube, on Facebook, not as much on Twitter or other, probably TikTok is very large now, but I don't have the latest numbers to talk about it. So with as many people using social media and hearing about its cancer cure, people started wanting to take it, demanding from scientists and demanding from politicians and physicians that they would be given this. And we had a very particular, very different parliament member that tried to make this drug into a medicine and to give it to people. This happened in 2016. We had a cure by decree. So the drug didn't go through clinical trials. It didn't even manage to go through it because it doesn't work. But we had a parliament member making a law project that the president signed so that they would give this drug to people. Then this parliament member became our president and kept this attrition with science very well and very live. Last year, we had, for example, a very respected scientist, Carlos Nobre, head of a institute that uses satellite images to talk about the environment. Something they did was to point at we had one of the largest burning of forests of the last decade or so in 2019. In 2018, it was huge. The next year, 2019, was even bigger. This year, also this size. And his response was first to discredit the scientists, say that he was faking his results, saying that the fires weren't in Brazil, they were in Bolivia or somewhere else. And when he wasn't able to deny it anymore or to lie about it anymore, because the smoke started to fall in the south of the country, then he just fired the scientists and replaced everyone. So we have this past history of attrition with science and social media playing a role of giving people treatments and alternative facts about medicine and health. And this didn't mix up well for COVID-19. So Brazil was one of the last countries to have cases of COVID, at least one of the largest countries, one of the largest countries to have cases. Our first case started here in the 16th of February. And then we started to have new cases. At first, for the first month, we had a health minister that would go to TV and social media every day to talk to us about new cases we had, testing, the use of masks, protection, and everything. But he started to get too much attention. He started to get to make propositions that would interfere in the economy, like we have to close schools, we have to close workplaces, we have to close education centers. He started to get too much attention of the media because everyone was paying attention at COVID, and this didn't bite well with the president that just fired him in the middle of the pandemic. So we started to go a different path ever since. We had people trying to hide COVID numbers, COVID deaths, and we have now a cult about chloroquine going here in Brazil. So ever since the first results of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine use in France, ever since the American president, which is very close to ours, so we like to mimic them a lot, started to promote chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as a possible cure for COVID. In Brazil, it is the cure. It's true, it's what happens, it's what people have to drink, what people have to use, and we don't have to take any measures to protect people. We don't have to use masks. Our president was seen yesterday in a bar in a group of people without masks, and he's promoting this habit ever since the beginning of the pandemic. So they are all invested now in giving people chloroquine, and that will be the cure. So we have 120 official deaths at this point, something closer to 200,000 deaths in unofficial numbers if we count for excess deaths or undiagnosed deaths that look like COVID, and probably are, but we haven't tested enough to say that they are. So now we have these very big movements in social media promoting chloroquine as the COVID's cure, and questioning our numbers, questioning our reality, questioning the number of deaths. We had a parliament member that said we were burying empty caskets, empty coffins with stones in them, that we didn't have as many deaths as we now have. After Minister Mandetta was fired, we had a different health minister that asked to leave because he was forced to adopt hydroxychloroquine as a treatment. He wasn't willing to sign the law making it so he was resigned. And now we have a military that has no past experience with health, taking care of the health ministry in one of the worst countries of the pandemic for the last 3 months, a little bit more. And amid all of this, I was the person that did social media science outreach and that had a background in virology and epidemiology and could talk about COVID. So ever since February, I started using different social medias, different social networks for different messages about COVID. So on Twitter, I usually do papers and studies communication talking about the last scientific findings of COVID with either politicians, journalists, scientists, or a more technical public. That's the profile that we have of Twitter users in Brazil. So usually the communication on Twitter is more targeted to technical information, and it did well. I went from 200,000 followers to 1 million followers here in Brazil, and have informed journalists, politicians, scientists, and everyone here about the latest findings. On Instagram, I usually do short videos for house communication. So I translate those findings those technical findings from Twitter to a more outreach language, to a more broad language for more people, usually short videos that can be downloaded and shared on WhatsApp or Facebook, some other social media. It also went to almost 1 million people. I made also a Telegram group, a Telegram channel for sharing and downloading those videos so that people can put them in other social media. So talking about mask use, COVID, vaccines, the numbers that we have, and the epidemiology in general. And on YouTube, where I have the largest audience and I can put the longer videos, I started on my personal channel, so not even Nerdologia, that is already 3 million users big. It's a very established science outreach channel here, but I wanted to do something more personal and to talk to people about what was happening. I started doing lives, hour-long lives that look like classes. You can see the graph, you can see the numbers. This is the presentation I did to talk about the Imperial College estimates of the possible numbers of cases and deaths we could have in Brazil if we didn't act. This was my biggest presentation. This happened, I'm sorry. This happened on the 20th of March. This is when we had, I would say, our darkest hour. So we still had a health minister. He was communicating to people the number of cases we should see. And the Imperial College estimate was just released. UK was changing their politics of letting people just be infected to closing down and taking more care about COVID because of this study. And the first estimate that was drawing attention was that we wouldn't have enough ICU units to receive people and give them respiration. And in this day, the health minister used the same results and the same estimates that this study. So this is when I realized we were dealing with this problem. We were expecting as a country, as the health ministry here, the same kinds of problems that the study was showing. So I wanted to talk to people about the study and the estimates and what we would have. So this is the live show that I did here, explaining how we do epidemic modeling, how we estimate cases, what we knew about COVID, and how many cases we could have here if we didn't act. At this point, Brazil hadn't adopted any quarantine, masks, or anything. We were mostly expecting things to go well and not doing this much about it. So this is the live that was the reality thrown at people saying this is serious. We may have millions of cases, more than 1 million of deaths if we don't do anything. Brazil has one of the largest YouTube audiences. We had many people at home at this point watching lives, watching music videos and everything on YouTube. So this live was a big hit. It reached more than 5 million people at the moment. At the weekends where I posted it, this is what made me known here in Brazil as a COVID person, someone that talks about COVID, or as a biologist and scientist that talks about viruses. Just created invitations for TV programs, radio shows, and everything else. The TV interview that I did, a little bit after this, is the second most watched interview from Brazilian BBC here, that is TV Cultura. It's just a little less watched than the president's interview, but just made people realize what we had was serious, and cities starting to adopt quarantines, places starting to close. I can't say I was responsible for it or that people saw and had this epiphany because of it, but it's very coincident when we did all this information and the country started to close. So then we had science interfering in people's lives, and now social media reflects this as well. So we have very good results, people that became interested in science, that valued the information that I gave, and so we have fun memes coming out of it. That is like this drawing here that is basically me saying, where are you going? That people used to say, don't go out, don't agglomerate. And we have, of course, attacks, personal attacks, scientific attacks, and everything else that comes from having business closed, and some science posture that doesn't bode well with president or the main party, the main political party in Brazil at the moment. So the middle meme here, this picture of me without ears, is people scheduling to come demanding that we should have 1 million people dead by August, as the predictions or the studies, the projections would say we could have. So apparently by the beginning of August, having 100,000 deaths wasn't enough, and we should be demanding of Attila that we have 1 million deaths. That's what he promised. That's what he said. So this is people using projections, using the numbers, using modeling to say that science is wrong. So if we said there could be 1 million deaths and we don't have this much, everything else is wrong. We don't have to use masks, take vaccine, give vaccines to people, or take the precautions seriously, because scientists are always wrong. The other meme there is me as Greta, which I think is fitting. Is someone trying to warn people of a problem and being excused or dismissed in the same kind of way, the same kind of attacks. And the last one is the Twitter war that followed, with people saying that I was misleading them, that I was lying to them, which was trending and was #1 trending at Twitter, with thousands of bots and fake accounts tweeting this. And then started the movement of people thanking me, saying that I was helping them, or that I showed what was happening to them with thank you, Attila. That is the second one. So we have this now. We have a social media war talking about what's right or wrong about science or health or COVID and everything. Bogus treatments for COVID, we have plenty on WhatsApp. We have plenty of people drinking chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin. That is a lice control drug that people think helps COVID here. We have people saying that masks don't work. The president said last week that we probably shouldn't have to obligate everyone to take the vaccines, whatever comes. And we have talks coming out that if the vaccine that is approved is a Chinese vaccine, it will have a chip on it, or people will try to control you taking it. So social media is already gearing up to disqualify vaccines even before it's approved or any vaccine comes out. We probably will have a a big problem with this coming up. Brazil has already started to have measles cases again after decades without it, because enough people haven't vaccinated here. So we probably will have a very few problems with vaccines, whatever the COVID vaccine is approved coming up. Meanwhile, Brazil is walking this unique path of sideways cases. We don't go up, we don't go down, we just go sideways with almost 1,000 deaths a day here. So we probably have
Attila, may I interrupt, because we're getting to the point where we need to move on to the next speaker. I think your presentation has been really, really enlightening. And I really would like to thank you, and we will leave some time at the end to compare experiences with people in other countries, because your experience is really, really revealing of how scientific information can be taken out of context.
Yeah.
So I will, there hasn't been any question coming through the chat, so I think we will keep the question for the end, but it is quite something to see the level of lack of evidence-based decision-making in your country. It's pretty startling. So without further ado, I would very much like to introduce our next speaker, Angel Rodriguez Lozano, who's based in Madrid. He is a Spanish radio journalist and science communicator. In 2009, he created a website called Ciencia ES, Ciencia para Escuchar, which means science for listening. So it's very much a podcast platform with an audience of over 300,000 downloads per month. And now we're going to hear your perspective, Angel. We have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, thank you to SOF 2020 for the invitation. I want to speak about the interest on science during the confinement in Spain. In Spain, sorry, I didn't have the slide on. Let me see. Yeah. Well, on January 31st was the first case of coronavirus detected in Spain. And on March 15, the government created confinement until June 20th. And the first thing that happened here is that the social situation created during the confinement, as in most of the country, caused a change in life in most of the people and in the family and the social sphere. We have come across a very special situation, long hours being locked on our homes, with all the members around, having to work in different conditions than usual, and about all bombarded by a big amount of information. In this context, the first thing we see is an information coming from the Cabinet for Audiovisual Communication Studies that shows how the time that families or people spend watching TV changes from the beginning of the confinement to the following days. In fact, in this graphic, we have some amount of uses, TV uses, time uses. And on the 13th, when the government declared the state of alarm, rises around at 40% and stayed at that level from the months following. So there is a big expectation about COVID or that thing, but this, of course, this consumption of TV includes all kind of programs. You see, series, movies, etc. So in order to look how people started to attend to for the news about COVID-19, in that case, we have to talk about one population survey made by Ángeles Moreno from the Rey Juan Carlos University. And this studio, 1,200 people, says the first thing that does is look for the sources that people uses in order to be informed about COVID-19. And the first source, of course, is TV, with 86%, and more or less, a little less. The second is WhatsApp. This is something very interesting. So many people take WhatsApp as guide in order to reach to other sources of information. And the third is online newspapers. If you have, okay, the interview is huge, so have give a lot of information, but it's interesting that the alternative sources that maybe don't give us the correct information only have a 2.5% of followers. So this is very interesting. But okay, those are sources for the information. But what about how credible are these sources of information? In this sense, the same studio arrived to the conclusion that the most trusted source is the World Health Organization, 79%. This is followed by prestigious healthcare personalities that used to go to TV, to radio, explaining about coronavirus. Many people look for information in different sources for health sector. No, even from the COVID-19 committee or the government has 58% of the people. But once again, if we continue with this graphic. At the end, we have a few people that follow influencers in the media in general, in order to get that information, but not much of them. So I think this is a good information we have, but of course my work is with podcasts. Podcasts are programs, radio programs that you can listen whenever you want, when you want, and you can share with many people. So I have some experience to share about it. In this case, the first thing, of course, our podcast, we have around 14 of them, different classes, different types of podcasts, because they are differentiated by the audience they are made for. For example, the podcast Hablando con Científicos is talking to scientists, is the most valued one. They have the most number of downloads, in front, double than the rest. And this is a podcast that is basically an interview to a scientist who developed or explained his or her field of expertise, no, or his research. And of course, we speak about many fields of science, some of them difficult to understand. So, but in spite of all, is the most download of all podcasts. What means that whenever you try to explain it to people in a manner that can be understood, even the most difficult things can be understood. And in this case, if you compare in the graphic, you compare the downloads between 2019 and 2020, there is a rise. There is the number of downloads during confinement rise up to at 12.26%. What means that the information people used to were looking for, they came to podcast too, but these podcasts are talking about many subjects, not only COVID-19. In fact, we have only 10 programs about COVID-19 in Hablando con Científicos. Two of them that were interviewed to a collaborator of science of Ciencia is Jorge Laborda. He's a researcher in the University of Castilla-La Mancha, and there were two conversations about how the immune system and its role is in the defenses against the coronavirus. They had the highest download rate, but at the same time, there were others dedicated to quantum mechanics, for example, that have more or less the same level. So the interest in general rises for all field of science. One curious thing comes from the YouTube visits we have. Science is for podcasts, is audio. But some of the followers asked me to create a YouTube channel in order to put some pictures or images to the podcast that we already broadcast. So it's not the most important part for us, but the behavior during the confinement is evident, as you see in the picture. There is a peak around after the 23rd of April in May, and then after that goes down and went to the same levels than at the beginning. So this gives us to the end of my presentation, no? That what I have in my conclusion about this experience and other studios is that the confinement enhanced people interest in science, but most people were looking for trusted sources, for reliable sources, and the interest in coronavirus spread to other fields of knowledge, at least in podcasts. And interest dropped at the end of the confinements. It's a Gauss curve. And this led me to some questions. Always when I speak with researchers in order to invite him to participate in the podcast Hablando con Científicos, talking to scientists, I always say we are talking for people interested in science, but not experts. And this is a very important differentiation. You have to differentiate between people that is interested normally, like most of the people that are listening to me now, for example, but there are many people whose interests are not in science. And these people only goes to science when they find some special situation, for example, the COVID-19. So, but what happened with these people? If you are, for example, if you have a problem with a car, you take to the mechanics, and the mechanics say you have a problem and the solution is that. of course, you don't know anything about mechanics, but you believe him. But you left the car, and you expect that everything is going to be okay after that. And that is something that many of these people believe about science normally. But in these cases, we have many other things, doubts, changes of opinion during the pandemic. First, mask, yes. First, no. After, yes. The coronavirus translate or go to one person to the other through big drops at the beginning, at the end by aerosols, and now you have to face mask every time. At the beginning it was the flu or like the influenza, and now it's worse than that. So there are changes in the information that we receive for scientists that I think are created some kind of losing of interest or not trust in what scientists say. And so I think that the problem is that we have to communicate the science, but we have to communicate more precisely how science works. That's the difference. Okay, and that's the end of my speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for this enlightening talk. And really, it shows that there are some nuances from one country to the next, which really bring us to exploring what happened in the north of Europe in our next talk. Mm-hmm. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Cissi Aspel. She's based in the area of Stockholm. She is known for being the Secretary General of Swedish non-profit association VA, which stands in Swedish for Public and Science. It's basically a non-profit promoting a greater openness and dialogue between the public and scientists. So now what Cissi has to offer today is the result of a specific study that has been done in Sweden during the lockdown, and it's going to be a very unique perspective given the public health choices that were made by her country at the time. And we look forward to hearing about this exciting presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for this interesting presentation is already made. So coming from Sweden, probably you all heard about Sweden's somewhat different approach in the restrictions, the national restrictions, how we work to try to diminish the virus. These are some of the general advice from the Swedish Public Health Agency. And as you can see, there's nothing about masks. I think it's about 200 countries worldwide now that that's the official policy that you should wear masks, at least when there's a lot of people gathered. But these are the general advice that we are following in Sweden, and I think I don't need to explain them further. You can see for yourself. So how come we choose this quite different way of dealing with the virus in Sweden? I think it's partly had to do with that we in general have high trust or high confidence in both authorities and in other people, that you feel that you can trust people, you can feel secure that they will not harm you, and so on. So from the very beginning, which is, say, early March, when we all realized that this pandemic was coming to Sweden, this is the advice we got, and this is still the advice we have to work with and to adhere to. And trust in researchers and trust in science generally are also very high in Sweden. So my organization has been making attitude surveys ever since we started almost 20 years ago. And as you can see, the confidence has been quite consistent and quite high over the years. So this is the general public, people aged from 16 to 74 years old, answering questions about their confidence. And as you also can see, researchers working at universities people have more confidence in them compared to researchers working at companies. And that's also been consistent over the years. So we have high trust, and as I said, also between citizens and towards public authorities. And that makes that people are largely, I think, listening to the information, the communication coming from the officials. So this is one example of a public healthcare video that's explaining the coronavirus and how it works towards kids. So it's about that you should really use tvål, which is soap in Swedish. So it's a video explaining how important it is to wash your hands, basically. So what we've done, since we are always measuring on an annual basis attitudes towards science and scientists in Sweden, now when we realized there was a pandemic coming, we wanted to try to measure how people receive and how they perceive the information they get through the Swedish news media. So we found some funding from different sources, kind of a crowdfunding effort. So we could make several measurements over time. And now we just succeeded in getting some more funding, because we all realize that this will continue for quite some time. So it's important that we can continue measuring attitudes. So this first is a graph that show when they receive the news in media, how do they perceive the tone? So is it alarmist, or is it quite watchful? As you can see in the beginning, people thought the reporting was quite hyped or alarmist. And now over time, when we keep on measuring, we see that people regard the reporting as less alarmist. And it's interesting to see what happens now when we have more cases again coming, and maybe a second wave coming. We'll see what happens with the results. So we made 7 surveys so far, and they have an 8th one. We haven't analyzed those results yet. So we will continue to measure once a month. And this is done by web panels. So we're using one of the biggest companies making those attitude surveys in Sweden. It's called Kantar Sifo. So it's web panels where citizens, adult citizens, around 1,000 respondents each time. And now I'm trying to move to the next slide, but it doesn't work to move on. So maybe I should stop sharing and then go back to sharing and see if it works better.
There's an arrow at the bottom left of the...
Here we go. Thank you. So we also asked people about what are the main channels or the main sources of information, which news media are you following? So you see the question yourselves. The most common source would be the Swedish television, that is national public service television, followed by Aftonbladet, which is one of the evening papers, and TV4 is a more commercial TV channel in Sweden. So we see that also, as in Spain, that people are more going to traditional media to get information about the virus. And of course, also that was most prominent in the first months of the pandemic. So we see over time, as you can see from the figures, that the number of people stating that they have been following news from Swedish television have decreased on the 8 percentage units over time. And it's also interesting to follow this over time if there's, as suggested, a fatigue, that people are not so interested as far as it's nothing dramatic happens over time. I also wanted to share with you, we are also asking about confidence people are having towards different sources of media in the reporting of the coronavirus. So I wasn't surprised to see that the public service television, the public service radio was among those with the highest people regard them having the most trustworthy news reporting. And as you can see also over time, the level of confidence people have decreased for all those media channels we asked about. And we also asked about the confidence people have in different groups that are commenting on the coronavirus in the news media in Sweden. So you can see here that over time, all the doctors and other healthcare professionals have always had the highest confidence, followed by researchers. On the more bottom end, we find politicians and also journalists. And that's consistent when we ask people before the pandemic, when we ask for people's confidence in different professional groups, we see the same pattern, that the healthcare professional would come up very high and politicians and journalists quite low compared to other professional groups. And you can see that over time, this is quite consistent. It's not big fluctuations, apart maybe from government officials, where have been various levels of confidence. Coming to the end of my last slide, we also asked about how much in agreement people perceive the different professional groups communicating about the virus are in. So do they say the same thing? Do they have a consistent message? And as you see, once again, the healthcare professionals feels like they are very much in agreement. They are giving the same messages, followed by government officials. But when it comes to researchers, you see that people perceive them to have different views, so they're not so much in agreement, as also the case with politicians and journalists. And of course, in Sweden, we have really a lot of public disagreement among researchers. So there's been even a special group or a special forum of quite many researchers that have gathered to give alternative messages to the public and giving them additional advice, and also somewhat contradictory advice compared to the advice given by the authorities. For instance, the importance of wearing masks, which is not the official recommendations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting perspective, especially because it's national level perspective, and very often this sort of news doesn't get covered in the foreign press. So it's very, very good to share on such an international forum, and to also notice that there is some commonalities in the public perception right across all of the countries represented today, and right across Europe in general. So I will keep further question and debate for after the last speaker. I'm glad to introduce you now to Jens Deget, who is editor-in-chief of Science Story, which is a science communication portal which focuses in particular on podcasting. And Jens is also a long-standing president of the European Union Science Journalist Association, so very well known and respected in the circles in which we all evolve. In this particular presentation, Jens will present his experience of the Danish coverage during the pandemic, and also extend the analysis to a survey that the European Union of Science Journalists has undertaken right across Europe, and share some of these results as well. So we'll get the Danish and then the pan-European perspective. So Jens, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Sabine, for that nice presentation of me. Yes, we have had quite some experience here in Denmark, where when there was a lockdown, which came from one day to another, the whole press went belly up, literally, and they sent all the journalists home. And the next week, journalists in Denmark, I mean, the national broadcast was sending boring music on all channels all day. And most of the press had just put their journalists on standby. And that continued for quite a while. In the meantime, the platform I'm running, which is a private platform publishing on the internet, we got skyrocketing up with hundreds of thousands hits on social media, but also quite a large number of people who downloaded podcasts. And of course, we covered COVID-19 as much as we could in the period. But that made me think that this is quite absurd, that the most precious people to give you information about the pandemic, who could really help communicate the issues, the science journalists, they seem to be on standby. And I looked around to see how it was going in other European countries, and I asked through my Asia network and made a small little survey. And the results here are from Denmark, Sweden, Russia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Germany, Austria, Italy, Croatia, Spain, and Finland. And I thank you all for contributing to this survey. I'm not showing the whole survey, but just a small part of it. And we will continue the survey until we have everybody covered by it. But just for your information, the questions I'm presenting here: has the COVID-19 crisis affected science journalism and science communication employment? And that is the case in many countries. And I'm afraid it's to the negative side. And this also shows by this question is a support mechanism for science journalists, communicators who have become unemployed due to COVID-19. And it's about half of the countries where there are support mechanisms, and the other half there's no. But it also means that there is a need for support mechanism in most countries, because a lot of journalists have been laid off because the media have lowered their coverage. Then there's the question about the media coverage of COVID-19, if it's political determined. And this is also where we can see there's some diversity in Europe. A number of countries or journalist organizations from different countries, they strongly agree. Some agree, some don't think it makes any difference, and also some disagree. And then little group here strongly disagree. So it's very diverse. So are there any major problems with fake news on COVID-19 in your country? Yes, in the majority of countries, there are problems with fake news. And I can tell you here in Denmark, we have influencers with hundreds of thousands followers, young people who are now being told that the vaccine against COVID-19 will be a no-go. This is very dangerous information, and I don't understand how they are allowed to come up with this. And compared to that, the information, real information based on science is nothing compared to these influencers. Also, for the countries where there was a problem, I asked them to what extent is the media full of fake news, and they say around 25% in average. So it varies from like 10, 15 to much more. Do you have a code of conduct for how to communicate science to the media in your association? And that's because in Europe, I think it's very important that the journalists, they brand themselves and show why there is a difference of what work is being done by a science journalist. And it's important to add knowledge to the stories, so people can see the perspective of what's being told, and also it adds credibility. That's why it's also good to have code of conducts where people can trust the information that they are given. And also, oops, I go the other way, and it looks a little different, but not that much about the universities and the different associations in Europe, that they also have, to some extent, like half of them, code of conducts for science journalism. That was my presentation. I would like to add to this that I think that science journalism has really been affected by COVID-19 pandemic, and there seems to be this infodemic too. Politically determined news and fake information is circulating in many countries, even though it is diverse. And I think we should do something as organization. We could and should play a more prominent role in the media as knowledge brokers and reference in the media. So people are referencing to us who have been building up knowledge in these areas. Also, I think we need to brand ourselves better as science journalists with code of conducts and better organization of training and network. So we need to help each other to become better. I think that this specialty, which is science journalism, really needs to play a more important role in society, because it makes a difference if we are giving trustworthy information that people also believe in. Otherwise, we will have this situation where people have to choose between politicians they don't trust, or influencers they don't trust, or many others who come up with stories that they don't really know what is right or wrong. Of course, there's still a big trust in researchers, but that can also be ruined if they have to defend everything all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens. This is really interesting and unique data. I don't know if you're planning to publish this on the site of the Union, the EU SJA. Yes. It would be good to have it.
Certainly, we are going to publish this, and we are also working together with an EU cost program where we are going to do a survey among communicators all over Europe from 60 different organizations. So this is going to be a big survey which has much more questions than the ones you saw.
Excellent. So I think this is a very good transition to ask the first question to our distinguished panel regarding the role of science journalists during the pandemic. And apparently, based on what Jens has shared regarding the fact that journalists were literally put out of commission in the early days in Denmark, where there was in Brazil experience of not having people who have evidence-based as their source of information being put in front of the media as being really worrying, and with the experience also on the public trust of journalists being as low as it's ever been. There's really a question to be asked as to what can science journalists to be more prominent and more active in the media, because they do not have full control. The editors have control, the newspaper owners have control. And I can share this little anecdote of the Irish coverage of the COVID. Because they have staff journalists covering sports, they continue to cover sports as if that nothing happened because these people were paid. So they managed to cover sport with archive footage instead of reallocating the resources into more science journalism. And this is quite symptomatic of the fact that science journalists are not fully recognized and fully represented the way they should be in the media at the moment. So I would like to ask each one of you on the panel whether you could see some ways of raising the profile of science journalism in national media in your country. Maybe Attila, maybe you can have some ideas about how we can try and reverse that trend that, you know, journalism, science journalists are not the #1 priority in a lot of media organizations.
Sure, I'm doubtful of what we can do when the whole system is going against science or science communication like we have here. It's really hard to talk about science when the state, the country is promoting anti-science as something that is important. I would say the US is going through the same. But I think one of the most important ingredients that is missing is that we are not educated to talk about science in a politicization scenario. So we always or almost always assume the lack of knowledge model or lack of information model of science outreach, that people don't have this information, and if I give them the information, they will know, they will be interested, and they will act based on it. And it's usually not the case that people don't have the information. They usually either don't have the interest, as Angel has showed, that the interest was raised when there was a problem, so people had to pay attention to it, and they won't absorb information as a blank slate. This information has to go through their ideas, their ideology, their beliefs, and the whole political system of discrediting journalists, discrediting scientists that we have in many countries nowadays. So we have to be a little bit educated of science in this social media new world that we have, where people go to fake information as easily as, or easier than scientific information that is real, and have all these biases being put in them by attacks on science and outreach.
But at the same time, one thing you have nowadays that didn't exist before is that with the likes of YouTube and your channel, you have a counter power. You have, you know, a public forum that wouldn't have been allowed in previous time before that technology allowed anyone who had something to say to reach the
we would have basically no COVID information in Brazil if it was up to official channels here nowadays. So yes, this is very important.
Okay, so can I just move on to Angel? Do you have any view as to how we can counter this trend of lack of representation of science news generally in the mainstream media? Do you find that the podcasting route, which is again an alternative route to the traditional established media, is something that should grow and will grow in the future?
Sorry. Yes, I think it will grow because it's growing. The podcast media. No, but talking about journalism and science journalism, I have something to say. Is I was working for 30 years in Spanish national radio, and of course, I am a physicist and a journalist too, but I work at the Spanish National Radio as a journalist for 30 years, as I said. The problem there is that you have for many newspapers, for many radios that has not a big amount of money behind, it's very difficult to prepare a science journalist or a journalist specialized in science. So they have to cover many phases of the information. I remember at the beginning of the radio, in Spanish National Radio, that people who used to talk about science was people that was talking about notices with people, important people, or other kind of journalism that has anything to do with science. The problem is that they have very few people at the beginning, so they have to cover different aspects of the information, nothing to do with science. They were not prepared. Now there are some that are prepared, but I don't think that they, in a normal newspaper that has only a few journalists, they can't have a specialist. So the information they give is not exactly the well done as it should. So that's that is something that people don't understand, because if you say something that is not correct and somebody comes from other places saying that, okay, you are not correct, the correct answer is this, who loses is the journalist, of course. It's not the new that you are talking about. So we have to prepare journalists, science journalists, to speak about science, but many other journalists that are not prepared, maybe they have to take care what they say when they speak about science, because everything mixed together.
Yeah, it's a difficult challenge. So one of the person attending this session remotely has asked whether we need to rethink how we convey and communicate science, and we need to increasingly rely on social media influencers. And so that person quotes PewDiePie, which is a comedian and social media influencer with 106 million subscribers. I mean, this is in a way what you're doing. This is what Attila is doing with their own show on your own platform. You are an influencer, but you're not in the traditional media in a way. I mean, do you think more and more people like this will emerge over time, or is there, what is the way to grow these audiences?
Well, I'm not, I don't consider myself an influencer. Exactly.
But with 300,000 downloads a month, you are a kind of influencer.
Well, okay, okay. I spend all my life writing and speaking about science. Also, my expertise is in science journalism, exactly, not other way, because I never work for other things. In the case of podcasts, this is something different. What I say about my listeners is that it's what I said in my presentations. In my presentation, there is people that is interested. There is an interest in science previous to come to the podcast, and this is, I think, this is very important. But as there are different kind of podcasts. One is that I talk about Hablando con Científicos, but there are others that are designed or made thinking in people with maybe less level, scientifically speaking. So for children or for people who need news very, very well develops in order to be understood, even if you don't have the background to understand it. And so it's very difficult to put music, you make it most attractive, and then you arrive to an audience that is not exactly this high level, scientifically speaking, audience, but a very lower level that is maybe most important than that one, because if you are speaking all day long for convinced people, you don't, this is something very easy. But the real challenge is to speak for people that are not convinced, or that they don't know exactly what you are talking about, or they don't care, in order to grab their attention and give the correct information to them. This is the difficulty.
And I think maybe some of the other panelists might have something to say about that, about the difficulty to reach people who do not have a prior interest in science or knowing about science. Does any of the other panelists have something to say? Sissi, maybe?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that's what we think about all the time, don't we? How do we reach out to others when they're already interested and convinced ones? And I believe that this pandemic really offers an opportunity to do that. To get back to these sport journalists that continue to report on sport events which weren't happening anymore. In Sweden, and the country, we had reserved a lot of time during weekends for reporting on winter sports. And of course, there were no competitions anymore. So those sport journalists, they converted this, what's called the winter studio, to deal with COVID matters. So people were invited to ask their questions, and they invited experts, researchers, and others to talk and around those questions people were asking. So and I think actually it was quite successful. And I think one reason it was so was, and forgive me now, since I know you're working as science journalist, but it wasn't science journalists doing this show, but news or general reporters combined with sports journalists. So they had another approach, more asking, ordinary people's questions. And I think also that this to start in what questions people might have, which relates to science, could be a way of make people interesting, because it relates to their everyday businesses. And of course, now during the pandemic, everyone is affected by the pandemic. So everyone would be interested in the science related to the pandemic. That was just a few thoughts.
Thank you very much, Sissi. So I think Jens wants to add something.
I have to unmute my telephone microphone here. No, I just want to say that it's 20 years ago since I left the national broadcast, where I had the most popular program on science in Channel 1. And still, I think it was a daily struggle to work with the management, because none of them had any scientific background. And I think this is a general problem with the gatekeepers in the media, that people with scientific background are extremely rare, and they don't understand nor respect science very much, even if people are really interested in science. And I can tell you that I looked into the 5-year strategy from the national broadcast recently. They published, and they mentioned culture 51 times. And they even have a little chapter about handicap swimming, but they don't mention science one single time in the whole strategy plan for the next 5 years. That's the level that they have. And I think that's a problem in many media, that there's nobody who is sitting there really interested in science and telling why is this necessary. I even remember one of the major national newspapers. They had a science section which was really popular, very well written. And when they closed it down, they were asked, why did you close it down? And the reason was not because it wasn't popular, it was because it was very difficult to find people to put adverts in it, because everybody read that section of the newspaper. So there wasn't any defined group who read it, and therefore they couldn't sell adverts. These are the kind of mechanisms which we are up against, and we have to be much more focused and maybe even cynical about how we sell science. Also, I think there are people who can sell science anywhere. I think Attila, for example, he has the punch to sell it even where they don't believe very much in it, because it's so convincing when he's talking in Portuguese that even I have tears in my eyes. So I think that's where we need to go. We need to mobilize people and also be aware that there's a level of ignorance that we have to get over. And if we do that, I think that quite a lot of people will be really interested in science.
But this is really an important point. Isn't it the problem, and Attila might have some thought about this, that there's somewhat a lack of scientific literacy overall in society? You know, the baseline knowledge that the society has is such that it's very much geared towards sports, towards, entertainment, celebrities, but the level of literacy about baseline science is fairly low. I mean, is that something you've encountered, Attila, with your audience?
It's very true. I think here about 500 years after Galileo Galilei, he made his thesis that the Earth is circling around the sun and not the other way around. Most people in the world actually believe that the sun is circling around the Earth. So we have a problem here, and I think that we need not only more literacy, but we need to do a focus change with those who are the gatekeepers in the media, because we cannot afford that society is ignorant. We have COVID now, but we have a huge task to cope with the climate change and many other issues which are coming up in the upcoming years. So I believe that we need to focus much more on information and have managers in the media who has understanding for it.
Okay, I think this is the right time to actually introduce another question that maybe Attila can answer, because it's related. We have a question from one of the member of the audience that is wondering, how do we get scientists involved in activity that the public is interested in, and not just expect people to look for scientific information? You know, how do we make sure that there's an awareness as to what the public wants and what the public asks for? So maybe Attila, in your own experience, how do you choose your topic? How do you decide what your public actually wants? I mean, how do you have ways of analyzing your statistics? Do you just come up with ideas based on your own interests? You know, how do you match the needs and desire of your audience?
Oh, sorry, the microphone was muted. I think it's an exercise of empathy towards the public. Empathy of understanding that not everyone will have the scientific background, for sure. So many times we have to, especially if we want to broadcast it to a large audience, we have to make it as simple as possible, but not as simple as making people forget how it's done or how we know what we know in science. So this part is important. And I think spam and fake news have a lot to teach us on how they spread and how they appeal to emotions and everything. Not that we have to do the same, but we have to take into consideration those biases when we talk about science. It's way easier to grasp people's attention with fear, with stories, with cases and everything that all fake news try to do and end up doing way better than hard facts and scientific information. So I use numbers, I use social media especially to choose topics. So I usually talk about science either from something that I appreciate myself, that I know that I will make a passionate video. So I'll try to bring people with my love for science, or I'll look for what people are watching or searching or Googling or sharing on social media to try to bring science to that topic. So Nerdologia, for example, that is my first YouTube channel on science outreach, has a very big audience in Portuguese, mainly because we usually use topics of movies, games, social media to explain them with science. So we have to go a step further, and instead of presenting science and expecting people to like it, grabbing something that people already like and putting science into it. So I do kind of a scientific spam of talking about what people already like and bringing science to it, so that we can cultivate this interest and seeing that their life could be richer using this kind of knowledge to explain it.
That makes a lot of sense, and that would, in a way, we haven't seen much of the science of sport by these science reporters when they were off commission. So that's a bit of a missed opportunity indeed. The other theme that seems to be coming back from all of your intervention is the idea of fighting fake news or countering fake news. And as you said, they use a language that's very certain, that appeals to emotion, whereas anyone doing science communication always says, oh, maybe, possibly, perhaps, hypothetically, we found a cure for COVID. You can't fight that fight because you're not using the same weapons, and the language is really important.
You don't have as many alternatives. Usually the fake news we see has gone through some natural selection. You have like 300 different versions of a story, and the one that sticks to people's mind is the one that's being shared. We always try to control what we say. So you have these conditions of the numbers have to be accurate, the story has to be accurate, it has to be scientifically, historically valid and everything. So we have constraints that fake news don't have. They just have to be spread. So specifically to fight fake news, I only believe in educating people to be critical about information. I don't think we have either the breadth or the disposition to try to outrun it. It's unfair.
So does anyone else in the panel have a view on how to instill critical thinking among wider audiences? This is one of my dearest topics, because at SciencePod, our platform, we actually create science story on demand. So it's obviously commissioned by a sponsor, but this is one of the biggest theme that we represent ourselves on: the ability to provide critical thinking on demand to create stories related to original scientific research. So I'd like to hear very much from other panelists as to whether they can see critical thinking, ways of instilling critical thinking more at educational level in society, or through other means. So perhaps any of the other panelists want to step in on this? Yes, Cici?
I mean, there have been quite a few examples lately about trying to myth bust strange claims and false information regarding the pandemic and the coronavirus. We all know that to be successful is not just to tell people that you are wrong, this is the right information, but you also need to get some kind of sensor that we are all into this, get people more to know the generic ways of questioning and be critical to their sources. So I think it's really good if you can do games that can help in a fun way to get people to think about how trustworthy is this, and how can I check whether this is true or not, or even just always ask a question like, how do you know that? How can I be sure of that? What are the evidence behind these things? So that's something I would like to suggest.
But where do you teach that? At what level? At what point in society do you try and convey these?
It can be through schools, of course, and there's a lot of information about source criticism, at least in Swedish schools, and I'm sure in your countries as well. You can go through traditional media. You can use those influences. So this PewDiePie, he's actually a Swedish guy. So I'm not sure I know him well enough, but to use these kind of people that young people can relate to and are interested in, and to collaborate with them might be one way.
Okay, and does anyone else think that there is a responsibility for the platform themselves? Google News famously introduced some fact check tag in some of their news reports. There is some movement there on Facebook as well to try and self-regulate and limit the spread of non-fact-based news. I mean, do you think to an extent those people who are the main publishers de facto, the big platform, the social media platform, have a responsibility that hasn't been fully explored and fulfilled?
Can I make a point there? I think as much as they deny they are publishers, they are responsible for some of the content that they share, and they have to be willing to accept that the biases that they introduce in the platforms promote bogus science, promote fake news. When we try to maximize grabbing people's attention, nothing grabs as much attention as a fake story that's made to be emotional, to be outraging or something like this. So it's always, at least what we know from Twitter research shows that fake news are more liked, have deeper penetration in different publics, and go faster through the internet. So it's the way that people's minds work, what we like to comment and share, the way that the platforms work by maximizing people's attention and the time they spend on the platform, this all will promote more fake science, more fake information than verifiable information. So unless they are willing to accept this and provide some mechanisms to either check the information or point to what's the right way or block fake information that is damaging to people, we just can't compete with people's attention on those platforms. We will end up only talking to the more educated ones that themselves filter what they consume, but not the broad public.
Okay, so we've got a few seconds left. Would Jens step in, and then everyone, Angel and Cici, a last word?
Yeah, very, very, very short. No, I don't think that fact checkers can compete, as Attila says, with liars and people who are spreading false news. I think we have to have something different from fact checking. We have to have storytelling and coherent stories which explain things in perspective, so people understand what a vaccine really is, how it works. Long before vaccines are being criticized. So when the criticism comes up, then they will say, yeah, but this is not how it actually works. So you become confident in the things if you have more knowledge about it. And I think this is knowledge we have to spread and sell.
Okay, last word, Angel. Do you have a last word? You're muted.
Your mic.
Sorry, Sorry again.
You have 20 seconds to give Sissi as well as last word.
Yeah, okay, last word. We have to be careful. We have to treat the people well. And if you want to convince someone, you don't have to take him, to call him idiot. You have to be careful.
Yeah, respectful. And Sissi, the last word to you.
Yeah, I think it's really important to not only tell about the results, but also, like Jens said, how science works and how vaccine works, etc. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you today. It's been a really fascinating debate, and I hope that we'll continue to try and find solutions to get the fact-based and evidence-based news greater profile. But all of you, in your own way, are contributing to spreading the awareness of the importance of this. So thank you.